Hey CC family, I'm pretty sure you and your family are enjoying this time off from school as summer break is just beginning. Just to let you know, our program here at church is going to continue. We're taking a break for our Friday nights, but our Sunday morning, both the first and second hour, are still moving forward. So if you're here, if your family's not planning on going on vacation, I greatly encourage you to still come to be a part of this opportunity that we have together to teach your kids about Jesus and to help them come to a place of faith themselves. This Sunday, June 16th, we're going to be coming together to learn a couple of things about who Jesus is. Looking at our first hour, we're still looking at the life of Paul as he's going through all these different missions journeys all throughout the world. And so for this week, we're looking at how Paul continued to visit churches. And so we'll look at the story of Paul's third missionary journey, looking at Acts chapter 18 to 21. And so during these chapters, most of the time when Paul went out for his missionary journeys, he went mostly westward. And so he spent most of his time in Europe, in that area, looking at some of the Mediterranean Sea and the countries and cities that surrounded that area. But for this one, he turned his attention eastward and actually went through a number of places in Asia Minor and explored that region as well. And so each of these places that he stopped at, he took every opportunity that he could to share the gospel with more and more people and to share who Jesus was to these people as well. Now, obviously there's a ton of different places that he went to go visit and multitude of people that he talked to. But there's a couple of specific interactions that happened that we felt are important to bring up with your children, important lessons that come out of these things. And so first of all, one of the first experiences that he has is within the city of Ephesus. When he went to go visit the city, there were 12 individuals who came before him and explained to Paul that they knew who John the Baptist was, but they've never really heard of Jesus. At least news of who he was never really reached them. And so Paul had the opportunity to explain to them and to share who Jesus was and how John the Baptist pointed forward to Jesus's arrival and how he ushered him into ministry to do his work on this earth. And so he had the opportunity to share more and more about who Jesus was. And he actually ended up spending a considerable amount of time in Ephesus. In fact, it came out to about 2 years and about 3 months that he spent in this location, just sharing the gospel with the people here. And all during this time, there were individuals who came to visit Paul who brought these garments or articles of clothing of people who were sick and who were disabled, came to Paul, and Paul was able to bless them through touching these robes, offering up prayers to God. And when these people brought those articles of clothing home, they were miraculously healed, all through the power of Jesus. And so that teaches us that Jesus is, in fact, a powerful God. Even though he is not on this earth anymore to do his ministry, he was working through Paul to accomplish these things and to draw more people to him. And so we get to learn that we as followers of Christ can still be used by Jesus, even if he's not here on this earth. That we can call out and cry out to Jesus to equip us and strengthen us to do the work that's set before us. And through his power, we can do great and mighty things to celebrate and honor his name. Now, it can be easy for us to twist these things and to be selfish with these things. But thankfully, God allows us through the work of the Holy Spirit to renew our hearts and to turn us to desire things that magnify and glorify his name. And so all of this power that we've been given through the Holy Spirit is not for our own selfish gain. It's not for us to draw attention to ourselves. It's not for people to see how great we are, but instead to see how great God is. Now, another interaction that Paul had was with a small child named Eutychus. Now, Paul was enjoying the Passover meal with a group of believers, and he started teaching about Jesus in this room. Now, Eutychus, being a smaller child, didn't really have space amongst the crowd, so he sat in an open window area. And when he was sitting in that area, he started slowly nodding off to sleep since it was late. It was almost past midnight at that point. Started nodding off to sleep to the point where he actually slipped and fell out of the window. Now, unfortunately, he fell about 3 stories down and landed hard on the ground and died. But thankfully, the story didn't end there, because when Paul went outside to go find him, found Eutychus' dead body, prayed over him, and was able to raise him back to life. Now, this could be a little bit more of a confusing story, but it's, again, a continual iteration of what we talked about during that first interaction. That through the power of Jesus and the Holy Spirit, we have been given the ability to perform great and wonderful things. Now, we might not have that power to go and to resurrect people from the dead or to cure these diseases that we believe are incurable, but there are still great things that we can do, all because of the power of the Holy Spirit. Things like showing grace to one another, having patience for other people, having a desire to love and show that these people belong. We often discredit those things, thinking that they're not as glamorous or magnificent or awesome as some of these other things that we read about in the Bible. But if we take the time to actually think about them, they are truly wonderful and magnificent and awesome. The fact that we can have patience with another person, think about how short some of our willingness to be patient can be. There's a lot of times where we feel like I'm just being pressed to my limit. And we know that and are cognizant of that. But the Holy Spirit gives us even more patience to extend further than what we're naturally capable of. Or love and care. There is a physical limit to how much we can do these things if we are apart from God. But by partnering with God, having the Holy Spirit in us to renew our hearts and our minds, it gives us the capability to love that much more, to extend God's love and grace that much more. And so these are all incredible and awesome things that should never be discounted. And so that's another thing that we learn here. And then the final interaction that's important for us to talk about is as Paul is making his way back from his journey and he's coming back into Ephesus, he's able to meet with some of the elders just outside the city. And during this interaction, he continues to share with these people about Jesus, but he also starts sharing about his conviction, specifically how far his conviction will go. And so he explained to these people that he's willing to keep going, to keep progressing, to keep sharing, to keep traveling, to do everything in his power, all to proclaim Jesus. Even if the threat of death is in front of him, he would continue to push forward. And so that's the level of conviction that Paul has here. And so what that teaches us is it shows us that we too should share in that conviction. Now, we're not asking you to put yourself in harm's way and to be confronted with death on a daily basis. But we're still asking you to have that level of conviction, or at least to check yourself to see where your limitations are with that. Could it be that there are some external factors that are keeping you from sharing Jesus at every single moment in your life? Things like embarrassment or peer pressure could have a factor to play in this, or persecution or threats could also have a part to play to keep us from doing these things. But if we're to see the life that Paul lived and the way that he viewed Jesus, he knew that Jesus was the greatest thing he could ever have, and that there's no point to holding on to anything else in this world so long as he has Jesus. And so because he knew that, he also knew that others needed to have that same disposition. And so that's what fueled his conviction, knowing that he has this intimacy before Jesus and he sees others who don't. He knew that they needed to know as well. So he was willing to go to any length, even to the point of death, to share Jesus with others. Now, as we reflect on all of Paul's journey throughout this area, there's a couple of things that we can talk through. And in fact, it actually lines up with these 3 individual vignettes that we're highlighting here. And so first, by looking at his first stop in Ephesus and the way that he shared with all these other people, what we get to see is that prolonged amount of time that he spent in this area. And so what that tells us, and what we can start thinking about, is what is a long-term project that we can work on to share Jesus with others. In other words, who is a group of people or a single person that we can commit to long-term in terms of sharing the gospel with these people or with that person? Now, we all have people in our lives that are able to receive Jesus and in the first couple of interactions come to know who he is and dedicate their lives to him. And that's a great and wonderful story. But oftentimes what we see, especially in today's world, is that's not really happening as much anymore. It still does, but not as often. What we normally see now is that the journey to faith is a much longer one. It takes time to work through all of these little caverns and areas that have been carved out by sin in our hearts. And so if we're going to share the same convictions that Paul has, to be dedicated to that same extent that Paul is, can we as one family unit commit ourselves to a group of people or a single person for an extended period of time? Now for Paul, he spent 2 years and 3 months here. For you, it could be shorter than that, but it could also be longer than that. But we have a call to still be committed to this work, no matter how long it takes. And so naturally, this brings up questions for you and your kids in terms of, well, do we stop at some point? If we're continuously pouring into this person, does it make sense to just call it quits after seeing no results of the work that we're doing? Well, of course not. We still move forward, we still keep trying, and we still keep sharing the gospel with them. And so this is an opportunity for you to check in with your family to see maybe there's areas that we've decided to kind of pull back or give up on. And when we identify those things, this is a conviction that we get from reading this passage to renew our desire to share the gospel to this person or people. And so no matter what group or who you're specifically interacting with, continue to pray for these people and pray that God would continue to correct and change your heart so that you would have that same level of conviction that Paul has, to never stop until they come to a point where they too can believe in Jesus. Looking at the second little vignette that we had, dealing with the death of Eutychus and being revived. If we look at that interaction and we see the power that Paul's words had here, this gives us an opportunity to reflect on the power that was given to Paul. So the question here is, what gifts or power is God giving you to share the gospel with others? And so here you could talk with your children about some of the giftings that they have. Again, some of your kids are incredibly patient. Some of your kids are incredibly welcoming. Some of your kids are incredibly understanding. And on that list goes. But identify with you and your family these strengths, these gifts, this amazing wealth of power that God has given them and equipped them with as they go out and minister into the world. And so as you identify these things, this is a chance to strengthen those things. So not only can we identify that God has given them these wonderful, wonderful gifts, but pray daily for your children that they would grow in that. That if they're already patient, God make them even more patient. If they're welcoming, God make them even more welcoming. If they're understanding, God give them even more understanding as they continue to interact with more and more people. Whatever it is that your children are naturally gifted at because of the way that God had designed them, pray that God would magnify it, all for his glory. And looking at the final interaction that happens here, what we end up seeing is this willingness to die for Jesus. And so coming out of that thought and coming up with our final question for the first hour is, what limitations do you have when it comes to sharing Jesus? This is an opportunity for you and your family to work together and have this conversation about some of the things that are holding you back. What is essentially gatekeeping you from sharing the gospel wholeheartedly all the time? Could it be that you're easily embarrassed and feel that you are ashamed of your faith? Could it be that you're in a context that isn't friendly to having Christ's name shared, and that's why you're opposed to sharing all the time? Or maybe it could be, I just feel like I'm not well equipped, I don't have the knowledge, and I can't do these things. Whatever it may be, identify those things and ask for God to renew your thinking with all of those things and to pray for opportunities in each of those moments. So in this moment where you may feel a bit embarrassed or ashamed, would God give you confidence and boldness to share in those instances? Or if you're in a situation where it's difficult to share the gospel, where it's actually looked down upon and there's some level of persecution that you would encounter, pray that God would renew that moment and create an atmosphere that's more accepting. Or if you feel you don't have the knowledge, you don't have the training, you don't have the experience to share the gospel, ask for God to renew your mind and your thinking and your knowledge and wisdom so that you do have those things and you can go out into the world. Now, dealing with your kids, it's taking these larger scale things that you're working with and bringing it to their level. Again, they're just starting to see these kinds of themes that you might already be experiencing. And so by you walking through this system yourself, it gives you what you need to lead your children through the same interactions that they'll experience. So it really begins with you. And that's the nature of this question, is it gives you the opportunity to experience this journey so that you can walk with your children through it themselves. And so hopefully all of that is helpful for you as you continue to grow as a family unit and continue to raise your children to pursue Christ in all situations. Looking at our second hour, we're still going through this series of being uniquely designed. And for this particular week, we're looking at the fact that God made us in his image. And so we're going to be looking at Genesis chapters 1 and 2, looking at this creation story of how God created us. Now, this is a very common passage that a lot of churches go through. And even if you're outside of the church, this is something that is pretty familiar and pretty common in terms of conversation. So there's a couple of things that we want to highlight and draw out in each of these verses. And so one of the things that we understand in all of this is the fact that God made all of these things using just his voice. And so we look at all of Genesis chapter 1. If we're going to take what's said there literally, that shows us that God, all God needed to do was just speak. And by speaking, these things existed. It's not like he gave order or command to someone else or something else to go out into the world to create this thing, and we had to wait for this thing to be built. No, it's God spoke, and as his voice, the sound of his voice, filled this empty space, things began, things appeared and began to exist. And so asking or commanding things like light to exist, or day and night to exist, or land and ocean, and the skies, and the birds, and the plants, and the animals, and the fish, and all of these things, God just said, let there be blank. And there it was. That's how much power God has. But in the midst of all that, what we see also reflected in Genesis chapter 2 is that continuing in all of that strength and all of that pattern of just being able to speak these things into existence. We look at Genesis 2 when God first made Adam, and this interaction is much different. Instead of just speaking Adam into existence, he took time to shape him and form him and mold him out of the dirt, and then went in close and breathed life into his lungs. And that shows us so much more of an intimate interaction. Instead of just commanding something to exist, he lovingly took time to shape and mold and design and create Adam. And if that's the level of intimacy that he had to the very first person that he created, there must still be that level of intimacy when he created you and I. Another thing that we get to see is that of all of the things that were made in all of creation, there's just one thing that he's created in his own image, and that's humanity. So he didn't make the light in his image. He didn't make the birds and the reptiles and the insects, all of these things in his image. He made humanity in his image. And that's a very, very important thing. And on top of that, after all of the things that he's ever created, he called them good, but when he made humanity, he called it very good. These are small details, but they give us this little nuance describing just the level of intimacy that he has for us, the uniqueness and the specialness that he's assigned to us, to show us that there is even more value in humanity, more so than all of these other things. And so what we get to learn as we reflect on these things is that because God made us, there's three things that come out of that. And so because God made us, first we see that we get to know what's right and what's wrong. Because we trust that God is a holy God, that God is the ultimate and perfect judge, that he himself has designed what is right and what is wrong. He has dictated and split those things, and he has defined all of these rules for us. If he's the one who created those things, and if he's the one who created us, we've been gifted with our own morality, our own consciousness that reflects that of God. And so if we're trusting that God created everything good, and he's defined what is good and evil, that we have an understanding of those things too. That we can turn to God when we have questions about these things and trust that we're receiving the truth. Secondly, because God created us, we get to know that we have value. We weren't just randomly spun together and randomly popped out and appeared in this world. It's not like some magician was out there waving this little magic wand and boom, we existed. But God crafted us in a similar way where he shaped Adam out of the dirt. He took time to craft and design us. And looking at Psalm 139, that intimacy of knowing every small intimate detail about who we are well before we existed. And so that's something important that we need to realize, is that because God took the time to design us, all of those intimate moments, in intimate, intentional placements of each detail of who we are, that gives us value. And third, because God created us, we also know and trust that we were made with a purpose. God didn't just bring us into this earth to just exist here for all eternity. He didn't just bring us here so that we just float all throughout time and space with nothing directing us or guiding us. But instead, God gave us life. God brought us into this world and designed us in this specific way to fit the specific role in this world. And so we can know and trust that we have a purpose in this life, a list of actions and a mission that God has given us to accomplish while we're here on this earth. And so all of these things gives us this beautiful picture of how God made us and uniquely designed us. And so when we reflect off of those things, we need to realize, again, those three fundamental truths about what happens as a result of God making us. And so one of the first things that we see comes from that idea of being able to know what is right and wrong. So the question being, how do we know what's right and wrong? I know I kind of answered that just a little bit earlier, but this is an opportunity for you to ask your children, well, how is it that they know the difference between right and wrong? I have a feeling one of the things that they'll probably say is, well, mom and dad tell me what's right and wrong. They taught me what I should do and shouldn't do. Or maybe they take that one step further and they say, well, I've learned what's right and wrong from school. They taught me how to interact with other people. And so because of school, that tells me what's right and wrong. And those aren't bad answers, but they're incomplete answers. At least they don't take us all the way to the fundamental truth. And so that's your job, and where you step in is to remind them that the only reason that you know what's right and wrong, and therefore can relate that and translate that to your children, is because God showed you what was right and wrong. And that if God created you to know what was right and wrong, gives you the knowledge and the wisdom to relay that information to your children. And the same goes for their schools. If the schools know what's right and wrong, well, God designed these institutions. He planned for these places to be there. He put people in those positions of power and gave them the opportunity to really work through what's right and wrong. And so when they're teaching your children about what's right and wrong and giving them a sense of morality, well, all of that's coming from God, because God was the source of all of that. And so this is a chance for you to work with your children to redirect their understanding and to redirect their perspectives back to God. All that we know about this world, all that we know about what's right and wrong, comes from God. Secondly, the other truth that we realize is that we realize we have value because of what God has done for us. That because God has created us, He's assigned us value. And now this is not an opportunity for us to compare value across individual people, to say, oh, I'm more valuable than you are. That's not the case. It's the fact that God Himself has assigned us value and sees us as indispensable. That we're not just this mistake that's been thrown around, but that there is purpose and intention and value for you. And so as we reflect on that theme, similar to what we talked about last week, is how do we value others? Now, a lot of this Sunday's conversation is understanding our own value, but we want our kids definitely to understand that they have value. That was the purpose of last week. And so as we're transforming that truth into this week, it's how do we change that perspective from God giving us value to us being able to see the value in others. And so here's your chance to work with your children to remind them that not just they, but all people that have been created by God have value. And so this is an opportunity for you to work with them to identify the people that are around them and identify what makes them valuable. In other words, for them to be understanding and to have this level of observation of the world around them, so they know that God's valued not only them, but the others around them too. So just start by looking at your child's class roster and just work with all of the different people that are in your children's classrooms and just ask them, well, what makes this student valuable? What makes this student valuable? What makes this student valuable? And on that you can go with that. And it's a simple exercise to get your children to step outside themselves and to identify what makes other people valuable, because God was the one who created them. And so as they identify these things and say, oh, I know that child, or I know that student, he's really funny, or this one is, always willing to share, or this one is valuable because they have so much knowledge and wisdom, they're so smart, and this student is just very generous with their time and always welcoming and always shares their toys and always plays with me each and every day. As they identify all of these things that make these students unique, here's where you can connect all the dots and bring them back to God. Well, if this student is kind and generous, well, how did they get to be that way? It's because God designed them in that way, and that's what makes them valuable. Or this student's really smart and has this knowledge and wisdom and is able to learn these things so quickly. Well, there's value to that because God has designed them in that way and has given them value. And on that thought exercise goes. So I encourage you to work with your children and just open up a yearbook, open up your children's class roster, and just work through each of these students that are in your children's class and have them identify these things. And third and finally, the conversation that we can have out of the third question comes from this idea that if God has designed us and created us, that we were created with a purpose. And so here's the opportunity for you to ask your children, what is your purpose? Now, this is a really big existential question, and probably a question that they'll be asking throughout their entire life. But it's helpful to start asking those questions now. And so if you ask them, what is your purpose? We'll probably see that their thinking and their mentality is within the immediate future. I can imagine them only really going and stretching their perspective out to maybe about a year and not really past that. Thinking like, oh, I want to do this one thing and I want to accomplish that thing. Okay, that would be great. And this is a chance for you to come alongside and partner with your children to see that thing accomplished. But even more importantly, this is a chance for you to expand their perspective and to expand their horizons in terms of what their purpose is, to help them realize that God has had a plan for them that extends well beyond what they know and experience today. That all of these lines converge to a single purpose of sharing the gospel with other people. But that looks unique to each and every person. And so here's a chance for you as a parent to identify and shape that path that they can follow down to be able to share the gospel with others. For some, it could be teaching and growing them in terms of their ability to disciple others. And that's the pathway that works for them, is that they can join discipleship programs, that they can bring other people under their wings and teach them and show them and guide them as they walk with the Lord. Or for other children, it could be that you could be working with them and building a heart for missions and building a heart for people who are overseas, who are less fortunate, who don't have access to the gospel. And it's shaping their heart to be able to know these people, and then shaping their heart so that they can have heavy convictions for these people, and then shaping their opportunities so that they have the ability to be able to go and to share the gospel abroad. Whatever avenue it may be, and it could look different for each of your children, and that's okay and that's good. But walk with each of these steps so that your children can come to know their purpose, their God-given purpose. And that brings us to an end for our second hour. In terms of memory verses, our memory verses are going to be the same for this week. So for our first hour, our memory verse is going to be Psalm 96, chapter 3. So that's Psalm 96, chapter 3. And for our second hour, we're looking at Psalm 139, verse 14a. Just that first line. So Psalm 139, verse 14a. And so as we come to a close, again, I'm looking forward to a summer break with you all, and hopefully praying that you as a family unit can find some much needed rest after a long time of being at school, that you and your families can do fun and exciting things as you guys connect as a family unit together. But again, I won't remind you that church is still here, and I encourage you to bring yourselves, your children, and even some of your children's friends to come and to visit so that they too can come to know Jesus. But until then, love you all.